On to other issues, an article that was written by Nikki Haley, who was saying that countries that the U.S. supports need to start showing that they support the U.S. back.
Exactly. She always likes to point to South Africa as one of the worst cases of a country that doesn't vote with the U.S., one of the worst top 10 cases. We vote 82% of the time not on the U.S. position, Pakistan 76%. So she's basically making the argument that our financial assistance from the U.S. should not go to us because we don't appreciate what they do for us. But really the idea of assistance has always been about development and never about whether your foreign policy is aligned to that of the United States. And I think it's a dangerous precedent because you can speak to any of the Scandinavian countries, they would never link giving you developmental assistance to whether you're going to vote according to their foreign policy thinking. So I think South Africa should just stand firm, and I don't think the US Congress is going to allow Trump to do this because he asked them to cut aid to countries that don't vote alongside the United States, and they refused that. So they did reduce slightly Pakistan's aid, but I don't think those countries who are friends of South Africa and the US Congress will ever allow Trump to actually succeed in what he's trying to do.
We also spoke about the importance of foreign aid in 2019. What kind of foreign assistance are different African countries requiring from the US in this time?
Well, many of the countries get, in terms of their budget allocation, quite significant amounts from the United States. But this is largely not changed. Like what we've seen under recent administrations of the U.S. under Obama, it's more or less been quite constant since George Bush's time in terms of what African countries are getting. There hasn't been any gross escalation of assistance to Africa, and if anything, there's probably been a reduction. So I think the Americans haven't shown any particular new interest, other than to increase their military footprint in terms of its bases on the continent. So I don't think any of the African countries really feel that they have to, at this point in time, turn around or reverse their independent foreign policies. And I think the AU is really encouraging countries to take an African Union position on certain things, and that's particularly in terms of having an African and independent foreign policy line.
She is arguing that foreign aid should only go to friends, which others have called transactional diplomacy. Is it telling of, as in a sign of the times, that countries that are financially supported by the US can, when it comes to voting at the United Nations, stand up and take a different stance?
I think those countries that really rely on aid, so let's say if there are members from the Eastern European countries or countries that really rely on, let's say, defense aid or defense support from the United States, they may be convinced to change their policy positions. But I think if you look up at the makeup of the UN Security Council, those countries that are basically
problematic makeup.
Yes. I think the ones that would have voted against regime change, for example, in Venezuela, are not going to that easily change their positions. And I think there's that battle going on for the soul of the right of countries to have sovereign independence and not have the United States and the Western powers enact regime change.
We need to start to wrap up. Let's talk about Venezuela. What is happening in Venezuela?
So right now we have a self-declared opposition leader who's self-declared himself as president of Venezuela, and he has Mike Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State, and Trump himself backing him. And what's very sad is that many of the European countries, some of which we even consider to be our allies, have backed this position. And I owe that largely to a battle in the press, because the Western media houses, if you look at AP and Reuters, many of the Western media, especially the broadcast media in the United States, they have created a narrative that regime change is in the interests of Venezuelans, that there is a humanitarian crisis, which there is, but that the only way to save Venezuelans from this terrible Maduro government is to have a military intervention. And this is very problematic because it goes against every aspect of international law and the rule of law. And this is something that very few countries have really been able to use critical thinking. And it reminds me of 2003, when it was so easy for the media to rally behind the notion that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and to basically back America's military intervention in Iraq, and we all saw what happened there. And this has been basically the beating of the drums of war within the Western communities. And unfortunately, it's quite difficult for those alternative voices to be heard. Even within South Africa, we rely so much on sourcing our stories from the Western media. We never get a narrative which says, you know, okay, there is a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, but this is a government that was democratically elected, and it can't just be deposed, and you can't also use humanitarian relief as a pretext to military intervention, which is clearly what's happening now. And we see the right-wing governments in Latin America, like Colombia and others, who are basically backing this regime change agenda.
But you're an ambassador, SA ambassador to the UN, Mr. Machila, during the week, made his stance very clear on this issue.
He gave a very powerful speech this week in the UN Security Council, and he basically put forward the view of South Africa and the BRICS countries, which is that we do not accept any regime change through unconstitutional means, that there is no military solution to what's going to happen in Venezuela. If we look at Libya, if we look at Iraq and Syria, we can see what happens when there is military intervention. And so he basically said the only solution here is dialogue, mediation, negotiation, and a political solution, and that is what the UN has been calling for. The UN said this is not about military intervention. This is a time for dialogue and for Venezuelans to choose their own destiny. And so basically he was trying to fight against this narrative of the United States, that the United States and the powerful countries know what's best for Venezuela and can alter the trajectory of that country by basically pushing forward a puppet government under someone, Juan Guaido being the opposition leader, that they've been grooming for almost a decade to take over in Venezuela.
Shannon, there's always so much to talk about in terms of foreign policy issues, but unfortunately this is where we're going to have to leave it. Thank you so much for giving up a portion of your Saturday morning to come and talk to us.
Thanks, Desiree.
Shannon Ebrahim is a